Try not to do that too much tonight. We'll see if we can. I may have been putting my computer through a little extra work tonight, so it may drop us. Let's see if it's up for it. All right, so I gotta figure out a name for this game. Can't just keep calling it a random superhero dice game. Need to name it something. Okay, so we basically figured where all the mechanics are. I think one of the things I didn't talk about a lot last night was I did mention having to come up with superheroes, and I needed to go basically chart out the different ways that I could give them special abilities. And I think one of the things that occurred to me as I was sitting there crunching the data of like, okay, so if each ability is um, either extra, it's essentially an extra die of ability. So an extra um, grapple attack or something like that. Or it should be the ability to exchange certain dice for other dice. So your character may be exchange all ranged defensive dice for any other die. So like you might roll for the theme of your character being a certain type. You might roll 4 defense dice, and one of them comes up, or one or two of them comes up as ranged defense. Your special ability may allow you to convert one or both of those over to, say, a grapple, hand-to-hand defense die, or it may your special ability may allow you to. So, like the special ability on each character card, theoretically, should include all the possibilities of converting. So either adding a extra ability, so like an extra hand-to-hand combat, an extra ranged combat, or an extra power combat die, or an extra defense in either of those, any of those categories, or an extra gadget, or and so basically any one of the 6 features that you can get on the defensive die or the attack die, there should be the possibility of having one of those be your special ability. And by the same token, anytime an additional power that you could potentially have as a power for a character card might be anything that a gadget item can produce, or a regen die roll could produce. So any specific gadget that you could get might be something like re-roll any number of these types of dice. And so you have the possibility of a fair number of extra abilities right there. But there's also a secondary category of bonus you could provide to a character, which is exchanging one for another. So in this case, I call them specific exchanges, and it would be a hand-to-hand defensive card, so a block card, could be exchanged for a ranged defense card. Or for another character, it might be you can exchange any ranged defense die for a ranged attack die. And that would be somebody who maybe absorbs an attack and throws it back, and that would be their power on that one. But there's also the third category of potential, which is exchange a say like a hand-to-hand defensive die for any other die. So you could do like exchange it for any other offensive die, any other defensive die, or any other die in general. And then there's the possibility of doing the flip of that, exchange any die for an additional die on a certain category. So in my mind, when I think about that, it's sort of like a character like Hawkeye of the Avengers. His entire gimmick is his bow and arrow. So for a character like that, an ability that makes sense for him is exchange any die, offensive, defensive, doesn't matter, for one ranged attack die. And you get the chance to use that ability once per 3-round combat. So it's not like you can use it over and over and over again, unless he gets a regen die on top of it. So if he gets a regen die, he gets a ranged attack die, and you have the special ability to convert any other die into a ranged attack die. He could do a ranged attack and then convert his ranged defense into a second ranged attack using a special ability, and then regen his special ability to do a third ranged attack. And so that would totally fit for Hawkeye. That fits that character. So what I was looking at when I was doing that is I built a grid, essentially, of like, okay, so if you have, say, a hand-to-hand combat offensive die, and you can convert that die into one specific other die as a special ability, all the other categories. So that would be 5 defensive and 6 offensive conversions, and so you're getting 11 essentially on that. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and then that's for you can get 11 types of convert hand-to-hand offensive, and then hand-to-hand defensive converts to 11 as well. And so I just went through all the possible rolls of a die and said, how many conversions are there for that? And then I did a section that was, all right, how many abilities could you make just an extra offensive hand-to-hand, an extra defensive hand-to-hand, an extra such and such? How many of those can you have? And then on the bottom of that list, I built a third list that was convert any one thing into any other thing. And so I built the list on that, and I said, well, okay, that's a lot of them, but I also feel in rounds of combat that only having one special ability that you can use once and never again felt like it wasn't doing the justice for given superheroes. So like, you don't have a superhero with a special ability that they use once in an entire comic book, or even in one fight in one comic book. They always have the ability to use certain themed abilities a few times in a combat. that can make the difference and save the day. And the other aspect of that is oftentimes you have characters whose abilities aren't just one hit wonders. They're not like the only thing he does is punch. Usually somebody who can punch really hard also has durability. It's joked around in the superhero writing community that it's called a brick. You are essentially there are two types. There's the standard brick, which is you hit like a brick and you take a hit like a brick. And then there's the standard flying brick, which is essentially a brick that can also fly. And so in that case, you hit like, you take a hit like, and you can fly. Those are three abilities. And I feel like having that capability for a character card is important for a sense. And so I kind of looked at it as at the possibility as perhaps every hero should have three abilities. And you can only use each of those abilities once. So if I need to, if I really do have a character who has one ability and nothing else, it would be three of those ability. Whereas somebody else with a slightly more broad portfolio of abilities, they would get one or two or even three of the powers available. And so looking at that possibility, I started to crunch the numbers. And even if I just did 3 powers for each hero character, and I limited it to one extra ability, one specific conversion, and one anything exchange. So you have, if you limit it to just those options, you end up with, I think, if I remember correctly, it was, I think it was 7,850 unique power combinations. So I could make over 7,800 unique superheroes. And that's before we even start doubling up on certain abilities, where a character could have 2 of any given power. So his set of 3 would be a repeat of one he's done before, or it's also before we end up with two heroes or villains or hero and villain pairs with the same power set. Like, we're ending up looking at something like, if I really wanted to stretch it and work it, I could build something on the order of 20,000 individual superheroes and villains. And like, that's insane. That's crazy. But that's the way the math works out. And so I was just I was totally caught off guard, but I built that chart out and I have it now. Not only am I going to potentially use it for making the first 8 superheroes, helping inform the character design and expansion packs for future. I don't think I'm going to do anywhere near thousands of expansion packs. That seems absurd. But at any rate, the other thing that it helps with, weirdly enough, is creating superhero characters. Like, you can really just sit down and go through, like, okay, so if I had a character who could take this, and this talent and combine them this way into a power set, what is that character? And the fact that there are 7,800 different ways to assemble that minimum, that suggests to me that in the entire history of comic book and superhero genre stories, we have not created anywhere near enough variety in our superheroes. We are limiting ourselves in certain ways. But anyway, I played around with that for a little bit last night, and a little bit. I spent a couple hours playing with that just because I got so into it. But I started to sort of try to figure out what some of that would look like as individual hero characters. And so I started to mess around with some designs on that front. The big thing I'm trying to figure out at this point is the setting, the world building. And so just as a dabble experiment, I started to assemble a list of superhero TV programs and superhero movies, and just say like, okay, so Iron Man 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a story of the origin story of Iron Man, but it's also the story of the villain. Where does the villain come from? And it's an ally who betrays the main character and starts supplying and selling arms to terrorist organizations to profit from. So right there, you have the basis of a mission. So you have terrorists armed with technology similar to a superhero's abilities, and you have to defeat the terrorists, and that leads you to the boss of the battle, and have that turn out to be a former ally character idea for the hero in a system that matches his abilities. So the Ironmonger in the first movie had a suit of armor that was based off of the first Iron Man armor design. It was much clunkier because he's not as good as Tony Stark was at developing his armor, but that right there is a mission that we can build. You have the terrorist henchman set and the former ally who's betrayed them to become an arms seller for the enemy. So right there is a mission. You can break down roughly about half of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies for plot elements like that. And it's not like you're not going to rehash it completely, but you're looking for like, who's the villain? What do they have to enable them to be a good villain? So do they have robotic booby traps that you have to get past, or do they have minions or monsters or whatever? And from that perspective, you say like, okay, here's the minion master, here are the minions or traps, and the mission is to prevent this person. So like the motive in Iron Man 1 was profiteering, weapons selling to terrorists. So a person selling weapons to terrorist organizations for profit. In something like Thor, it's the villain is sort of a mindless monster, and the problems he has to overcome are not necessarily minions in that sense, but like personal challenges. And then that movie, the Thor movie, also has an aspect of like you have to acquire a thing to finish the challenge. And so breaking them down into that sort of structure, what kind of villain, what kind of hurdles do you have to overcome? What kind of objects are needed to complete the mission? Is there a collection aspect? And just really kind of get a sense for story motivation and character types. And I could do that for a few of the movies and potentially some of the TV programs. And I could look at some of the DC Universe movies for some of that as well, and some of the DC TV series especially, where they do more of DC does better at TV than Marvel does in most cases. So that's a potential for breaking down and building up mission cards. I want to be able to build some modular mission cards, but I also want to see if I can string together a run of at least 5 mission cards into a linear narrative. And then the other thing I forgot to talk about last night was the gadget cards. It's an aspect of this game that I developed to be able to use characters like a Tony Stark character who can develop a new piece of technology to meet a specific need. And so in one round, he may have developed a shield. And so he has the ability to develop a shield item, a gadget. But I also think it's important because so much of comic books includes mad scientist type characters that, snagging a mad scientist weapon from the villain, whether it doesn't always have to be mad scientist, but like the Penguin's umbrella or the Joker's poison gas, or like the Scarecrow has a fear gas, and Mr. Freeze has the ability to freeze people, so he has a freeze ray. So like these are things that don't really exist in the world, but having them be a piece of tech that you can swipe from a villain or swipe from a hero or invent and use kind of helps establish that world type that I'm looking for. And so the other part of that gadget design aspect that I want to play with is, I think I talked about it before, where one of my favorite video games when I was younger was Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior. And those games had a massive chart full of all the weapons, all the armor, all the ability boosts, and special items that you could get in the game. And they all had illustrations for them, and they all had their stats, and then they all had a piece of mythology about them. This is crafted from the remains of an ancient dragon kind of thing. And I loved that. I love that aspect. And I kind of love the idea of potentially building a area in this dice game to have those types of cards show up. Now, I do worry a little bit about potentially making the game too much new cards, but gameplay mechanics centers around the dice in majority. The character cards offer an extra ability. The gadget cards, they offer an extra ability. But the combat and the interaction is done predominantly through dice rolls. So I feel like we're still safe on that score. But looking at the idea of generating artifacts and weapons and gadgets and armor and whatnot, I'm enthusiastic about it because it offers up an aspect of the gameplay that I like from other games that I've played. It was one of my favorite aspects of other games. So it does mean that for the first set of gameplay, I think I'm going to have to limit it to no more than 1 or 2 gadgets per hero card. So if I have 8 hero cards, I'll either do 8 or 16, somewhere between 8 and 16 gadgets. And I feel like there's room for plenty of missions, but if we stick to the 3 to 5 mission cards per game style, then I think it doesn't make a lot more sense to do anything more than 8 to maybe 10 mission cards for the base game, and then later on I can add new mission cards, new hero cards, new gadget cards. It is interesting to think that in this design that I've made, there will be expansion packs, but the expansion packs are always cards and not dice. Once you've got one set of dice for you to play a character, you don't ever need any more of those dice. Now, thinking about the first pack, if I do mission cards the way I was sort of thinking of doing them, what you'll have is a series of challenges that you have to overcome, or a series of minions that you have to overcome, and a level boss that you have to overcome. And each one of those will be set up on the card that you start with. And I feel like for replayability, I like the idea of having, I think I mentioned it one of the earlier times we were talking about this, was having the, say like a minion has 2 dice. One of them is the face value of a dice printed underneath the henchman character. And then you roll a handful of dice. So if you have 5 minions, then you roll 5 dice, and each one of the minions gets one of those dice. And then one of the random dice is paired with their base die that's always the same, and it's marked on the card. I like that design style, and I feel like the way to do that is have the card with the minions and smalls you have to defeat first on side A, and then the minion or boss on the back side, and that lets you reveal who the boss is. But that would end up making the cards a plaque rather than like a playing card, I feel. I might be able to make them a playing card. They'd be larger. They have to be larger to include, well, maybe not. 4 to 5 minions on one side. Individual pictures with dice symbols underneath of them. And like a title and descriptor for the mission itself. Flip it, details of who the villain is and the situation that you're trying to defeat, with the dice totals for the boss. Because the reason I want to do a turnover is it partly helps reveal who the villain is rather than you go in knowing necessarily. I could do some cards where the villain and the minions are all on the main card, and the backside is an additional piece of information. But I can also do a villain revealed by flipping the card over and have some of the description on the back of that card of the situation. The trick with a lot of that is to be able to fully describe the nature of the mission on the card, that you also have the pictures of the minions and the minion master and the dice they all have and all that. The other aspect of that is with the minions, like a 5 die for the minions, and each already has another die also. You use up 5 dice to defeat the minions. You re-roll the 5 dice to get the minion master dice value that you need to get to defeat them. And I'm wondering if perhaps 5 dice is a bit much for the minion masters. It might be better to do 3. That's again something that's going to come up in our playtesting. But all right, so where was I in the game design process last night? I think was I have the number of dice roughly should be 10 to 12 for each player, and then a 5 dice set for the villains or the mission cards. There should be maybe 8 to 10 mission cards, and then 8 hero cards. And the hero cards should have 3 abilities. For the most part, I'm going to start out with what I call the extra ability, the special ability, and the anything ability for each character. I'll expand it another time. I did get a point in my planning and thinking last night that I was like, oh, you know what? We could actually do like the main characters, like you build the stories of the main 8 hero characters under the foundation of the game and add heroes over time. But one of the classic comic book and science fiction tropes is the mirror evil universe. So I believe for DC Comics, they had their Kingdom Come, where it's an evil Superman and like an evil Justice League. And so an expansion pack could be that kind of thing where there's a series of missions and villains who are evil versions of the hero characters. I was like, that would be amazingly fun to do. And actually, I feel like what I would probably do, that's an idea. I'll think about that. For this first game here, the idea of the mission card with the minions on it and the backside has the description of the mission, the goals and the objectives and whatnot. But maybe having a stack of villain cards that are just the same as the hero cards. And the minion master, the hench master of that mission would be a randomly picked villain that you tuck under that card and is revealed when you defeat the minions or meet an objective on the mission card. That's not a bad way to go, actually, and I kind of like that. And it also gives you the possibility of playing the villain characters as another set of characters. So that's a possibility right there. So maybe like when I was building my stack of cards, for hero and villain characters to play, I was building 8 cards like that. So it's entirely possible to be able to play 4 hero cards and have 4 villain cards, and the players get to choose who they're going to play, and then the rest of them get chosen to be minion masters or hench masters. So if I do that, I may want to build, that's interesting. I may want to build my mission cards to have a certain number of missions that are specific to heroes, a certain number that are ambiguous, could be heroes or villains doing it, and a certain number that are specific to villain characters. So a heist or like a kidnapping or something like that. I think that's what I'm going to end up doing. I like that idea. All right. So that does tweak things a little bit in what I've been working on so far, but not heavily. I like this. All right, so I have to really do some planning, and now it's really down to story and world building and character design and gadget design. But that's more writing and a little less mechanics. So I think I've really worked out everything mechanic-wise in here, other than any fiddling that I may have to do after we do some play testing. When we do a little bit of play testing to see how it goes, I will decide what's the right dice balance for minions and minion masters in game. I think the biggest trick for using the villain playable characters as villain mission characters is, I don't know. I mean, if the villain henchmaster has their 3 abilities listed on their card, maybe that's, at most, they should get a defensive and an offensive die on top of it. But maybe they don't even need dice at all at that point. I do think maybe rolling a couple dice is important. But yeah, I was going to say, I was a little worried about the possibility of, like, you have to fight your way through the henchmen or the traps or whatever, and it costs you your powers and abilities as you go through. If you get to the end of the level and you meet the boss of the level, you're going to be drastically underpowered to face what amounts to another player. But if the villain or the boss of that level has only their abilities on their card, or their abilities on their card plus 2 dice, that makes it a little bit easier. And it's entirely possible to just establish a rule that once you've defeated the minions, re-roll your dice for the boss battle. So I do think, yeah, I think that's the way I'm going to go with that. So just working out these mechanics after that, just play testing them and adjusting to fit the actual goals is the last bit on mechanics that I'll have to worry about. The rest of what I need to do is universe storyline, character storylines, and gadgets. Now, gadgets, I think, are going to be heavily dependent on the characters that I put into this first game. And so from then on, the expansion packs are going to have gadgets that are also heavily reliant on the heroes and villains in the packs. The missions could very well be targeted specifically towards characters for origin story games and world building story game. And player versus player can just be modularly reusing those in a whatever fashion you want. I still feel like based on what I was saying last night about the theme needing to be a nice middle ground. Whoop. Did we lose you? Did we disconnect? Possibly. The middle ground between hero, light adventure, and dark and gritty anti-hero stories. That's an important one to potentially find a compromise where you could play them either way. And I gotta find a way to build a universe that doesn't have so much grit built into it, but isn't just sort of like a cheesy, like 1980s superhero cartoon feel either, but can be if you want it to be. Got to really work that part out. And so I'm gonna figure out like the background of the story that a couple of ideas that I pitched out last night were like a little more gritty of a universe, which is more along the lines of we've always had superpowers, and the age of myth was superheroes, and then we burned them all at the stake as witches during a chunk of our history, and so we nearly eliminated them from the world. But in recent times, we've started to see them reemerging. That can have a dark and gritty flavor to it. I don't want to do a universe where, there was a solar eclipse, and suddenly after that eclipse, we started to have superheroes show up. Like, I'm not doing that. That's stupid. I'm not going to do that. I want there to have existed superheroes throughout time. And I want to be able to explain why, there weren't huge numbers of superheroes fighting in the French Revolution or the American Civil War. I want there to be a legitimate in-universe excuse for that, and why, more superheroes didn't come out and get involved in World War II. I want to be able to explain that in a way that makes sense without having superheroes just suddenly materialize for no reason out of nowhere. But most of the time when I explore trying to do that, it comes out very dark and gritty. So I'm going to have to be careful about that. Once I establish the background of the universe, then I can build characters whose origin stories are playable story, and I can build a narrative within that universe of the universe's story that you can play your way into learning more about. So that's, I think, what I'm going to end up working on tonight. I think I lost you somewhere here. Hopefully it didn't cut me off at 40 minutes and I've just been talking for 5 minutes to myself and it doesn't record, but it's possible that it did that. That is okay. We will work on it some more tomorrow. I will catch you later. We're at 45 minutes in now. It's a good place to cut it. So take care and have a good night. So we'll call it there. That's good. End stream.